Aisha Davis stood at the podium, her heart steady despite the weight of the moment. In front of her sat Judge Thomas Collins, a figure known for his unwavering commitment to tradition and the letter of the law. Aisha, a well-respected attorney, had navigated this courtroom countless times, her reputation as an advocate for justice preceding her. Today, she wasn't just defending a client. She was presenting a case that could challenge outdated practices and push the boundaries of what the legal system could achieve. Her client, a young man named Malik, had been arrested for a minor infraction, a charge that many believed had been exaggerated by the overzealous policing in the area. Aisha had prepared an airtight defense, presenting evidence that the arrest was based on racial profiling and that the system had failed Malik at every turn. She spoke with precision, her arguments clear and grounded in years of experience working to change the system from the inside out. Judge Collins listened intently, his face unreadable. Aisha knew him well enough to understand that he was a stickler for procedural rules, but this was different. This was about more than just a minor mistake in paperwork. This was about the way the system treated people who looked like Malik. She didn't expect him to rule in her favor, but she hoped he would at least acknowledge the deeper implications of the case. When she finished, she waited for Judge Collins to deliver his ruling. The courtroom was quiet, the tension palpable. The judge looked over his notes, then glanced up at Aisha with a stern expression. She braced herself for what came next. Aisha Davis. Judge Collins began, his voice authoritative, but tinged with a note of finality. I'm imposing a fine for the procedural error in your filing. The matter at hand, while important, was handled improperly according to federal guidelines. You've been warned in the past about these issues, and I find no reason to overlook this one. The fine is non-negotiable. Aisha's breath caught in her throat. A fine. She had expected a reprimand, perhaps some stern words, but never this. She had been so focused on presenting her client's case that the paperwork mistake seemed like a minor oversight. But to Judge Collins, it was an unforgivable error. The fine was significant, a gesture that stung, both professionally and personally. Aisha's mind raced, but she maintained her composure. She had learned long ago how to hide her emotions in moments like this. Still, something inside her shifted. The injustice of it felt like a direct hit to everything she had worked for. She was no longer just fighting for Malik. This moment, this ruling, felt like a direct attack on her belief that the system could be better. She could feel the weight of it, and she knew, in that instant, that this was more than just a procedural misstep. It was a battle for the future of the legal system itself. Aisha Davis didn't take the fine lying down. As soon as the ruling was made, she felt a surge of frustration, but it wasn't the kind of frustration that would quietly fade. This was the kind that ignited something deeper within her, a drive to push back, to turn this moment into a platform for something much larger. She couldn't simply let it go. Aisha had spent years fighting for reforms in the justice system, and now, here she was, being penalized for a mistake that seemed so trivial in the grand scheme of things. For her, it felt like the perfect representation of everything wrong with a system that was more focused on minor infractions than on real systemic injustices. As soon as she left the courtroom, Aisha made the decision to speak out. She issued a public statement, one that would not only address the fine but also expose what she saw as the core issue: the rigidity of a system that failed to evolve. It's not just about one fine, she said in her statement. It's about a system that's stuck in its ways, a system that punishes the wrong people for the wrong reasons and overlooks the things that truly matter. The statement went viral almost instantly. The hashtag #JusticeForAisha trended on social media, and soon, news outlets picked up the story. For many, this wasn't just a case of a lawyer challenging a judge's ruling. It was a call to action. People across the country began to share their own stories of bureaucratic red tape and outdated procedures that had worked against them. Aisha's words struck a chord with those who had long felt the weight of an unjust system that didn't listen to their concerns. It wasn't just about her fine anymore. It was about a broken system that needed fixing. As the media storm grew, Aisha found herself at the center of a movement she hadn't entirely expected, but one she had been preparing for all her life. Interviews with her began to flood the airwaves, and she became a spokesperson for legal reform, though she had never intended to be one. She talked about her work advocating for technology in the courtroom, pushing for efficiency and fairness in legal proceedings, and fighting for better access to justice for marginalized communities. Aisha was known for her intellect, her tireless dedication, and her refusal to back down from a challenge. She had spent years fighting the kind of injustice that many chose to ignore, but now she was fighting something personal, a symbol of the very system she had been trying to change. Aisha's efforts brought attention not only to the fine but to her broader campaign of modernizing the federal justice system. She advocated for the use of AI in case management, for reducing mandatory sentences, and for reforming practices that disproportionately affected minority communities. What began as a personal battle against an unfair fine soon became a rallying cry for change. And Aisha wasn't going to stop until the system heard her loud and clear. As the media buzzed around Aisha's public challenge to Judge Collins, her name became synonymous with the fight for judicial reform. But behind the headlines and the viral hashtags, a deeper story began to unfold. The more the public learned about Aisha, the more they understood that this was not just a legal battle. It was the culmination of a lifetime of experiences that had shaped her views on justice. Aisha's childhood had been marked by a series of struggles with a system that often seemed indifferent to the needs of her community. Raised in a neighborhood where crime rates were high and opportunities were scarce, she had witnessed firsthand the ways in which the legal system disproportionately impacted black families. Her father, a factory worker, had been wrongly accused of a crime when she was just a child. Though he was eventually exonerated, the trauma of the experience never left the family. His case was dismissed, but the damage to their lives, the financial ruin, the emotional toll was irreversible. It was this experience that had ignited a fire in Aisha, a drive to make sure that no one else would face the same systemic failures that had torn her family apart. In high school, Aisha had started volunteering at a local legal aid clinic, helping underprivileged people navigate the complexities of the law. It was there that she first understood the true power of the legal system, the potential to either empower or oppress. This understanding drove her to pursue law at a prestigious university, where she quickly gained a reputation for her academic excellence and fierce commitment to reform. By the time she graduated, Aisha was determined not just to practice law, but to change the system from the inside. Her early career was marked by a series of high-profile cases that exposed the deep-rooted inequities in the system. She represented clients who had been wrongfully incarcerated, worked on reforming sentencing laws that disproportionately affected minorities, and advocated for the use of technology in courtrooms to streamline case management and increase transparency. Aisha's work wasn't just about winning cases, it was about creating lasting change in a system that was long overdue for reform. But it wasn't until her encounter with Judge Collins that the full extent of her efforts had become clear to the public. As the media began to uncover more about her history, they painted a picture of a woman who had spent years quietly dismantling the very structures that had once hurt her family. Aisha wasn't just challenging a judge's ruling. She was challenging a system that had never served her community. In interviews, Aisha spoke openly about her journey, recalling the emotional weight of her father's wrongful arrest and how it had propelled her toward a life dedicated to justice. "Every case, every client I've represented, it's personal to me," she said in one interview. "I fight not just for them, but for the world I want my children to grow up in. A world where the law is something you can trust, not something that harms you." By the time the public had pieced together the full picture of Aisha's past, she had become more than just a lawyer. She had become the face of a movement, a symbol of hope for those who had long been overlooked by the justice system. As Aisha's profile grew, so did the division between her and Judge Thomas Collins. The case, which had started as a seemingly minor issue of procedural missteps, had escalated into a national debate. Aisha's call for reform was gaining traction, with social media hashtags and news segments championing her fight against a system that many now saw as outdated and unjust. Meanwhile, Judge Collins, who had spent decades on the bench with a deep belief in the law's sanctity, found himself under increasing scrutiny. The public wasn't just criticizing Aisha's fine, they were criticizing the very system that had allowed it to happen. And that, for Collins, was a difficult pill to swallow. For years, he had prided himself on his adherence to the rules, believing that consistency and unwavering respect for legal procedures were the foundation of justice. To him, Aisha's challenge felt like an attack not just on his decision, but on everything he had worked for during his career. Judge Collins wasn't used to being the subject of media attention. Yet, as the story surrounding Aisha's fine gained momentum, he found himself on the defensive. Critics from all corners of the legal community, ranging from reform advocates to legal scholars, questioned his interpretation of the law. "It's not about procedure," one commentator said on a news segment. "It's about progress. Aisha is asking us to move forward. The system has to evolve." Collins read the articles, watched the interviews, and heard the commentary. The words stung. He had always thought of himself as a protector of justice, not an enabler of the very biases Aisha was fighting against. But the more he thought about her arguments, the more unsettled he became. Aisha was asking for reforms he had never considered. The use of AI to improve case management, the implementation of more inclusive sentencing practices, and the overhaul of systems that, according to her, disproportionately targeted marginalized communities. Could the very system he'd sworn to uphold be the one that needed the most change? Though his belief in the law had not wavered, a small, nagging doubt began to form in Collins' mind. Perhaps the law, as he knew it, was not enough. Perhaps it was time for the law to evolve alongside society's growing understanding of equity, fairness, and technology's role in the judicial process. The media frenzy surrounding Aisha's stance had not only amplified her message, but had also forced Collins to confront a reality he had avoided for years. The law was not just a set of rules. It was a living, breathing entity that needed to adapt. But Collins wasn't ready to fully accept Aisha's vision. Not yet. He was caught between his long-held beliefs and the undeniable truths being presented to him. Aisha, on the other hand, was resolute. She continued her public campaign, discussing the benefits of modernization and why the current judicial system, despite its strengths, was failing too many people. She wasn't going to back down, not now. The fine, the media firestorm, and the clash with Collins were merely the beginning of something bigger, something that could and would transform the way justice was practiced in America. The divide between Aisha and Collins had never been so stark, and as they both stood on opposite sides of a growing divide, it became clear that this wasn't just about one fine. This was about the future of justice itself. Judge Collins wasn't accustomed to doubt. For over 30 years on the bench, he had prided himself on his unwavering commitment to the law. He had built his career on a foundation of strict procedural adherence, believing that justice was best served by following the rules, no matter how rigid they might seem. The system, as he understood it, was clear, an unyielding structure that upheld fairness and order. But now, after years of viewing the world from within the courtroom's well-ordered walls, the challenge presented by Aisha Davis began to unsettle him in ways he hadn't expected. It wasn't just the media frenzy, nor the public pressure, that made Collins uneasy. It was the growing realization that Aisha's arguments were far more compelling than he had first imagined. Her push for judicial reform wasn't rooted in baseless criticism or an attack on the law itself. It was a call for progress. And the more he listened to her, the more he understood that her call wasn't merely about improving the system. It was about ensuring that justice, as a concept, remained relevant and effective in an increasingly complex world. The pivotal moment came when Collins attended a public seminar on judicial modernization, organized by Aisha herself. He had gone reluctantly, thinking it would be just another opportunity for her to push her agenda without real substance. But as the seminar unfolded, something shifted. Aisha spoke about the importance of transparency in legal proceedings, about how technology could streamline case management and reduce the inefficiencies that had long plagued the courts. She discussed the growing role of AI in assisting judges with caseloads and how it could be used to flag potential biases in sentencing. But what struck Collins the most was her emphasis on accessibility. Justice is not truly served if the people it's meant to protect can't access it, Aisha had said, her voice filled with conviction. We've built a system that prioritizes process over people, and that needs to change. Her words lingered in Collins' mind long after the seminar had ended. He realized that Aisha wasn't just proposing changes to the structure of the court. She was advocating for a more human approach to justice, one that recognized the disparities in the current system and aimed to correct them. And suddenly, the fine he had imposed on her no longer felt like a simple matter of following the rules. It felt like an emblem of a system that had become too rigid, too inflexible to adapt to the evolving needs of society. That night, Collins stayed up late, reading articles and papers on judicial reform and the integration of technology into the legal system. The more he read, the more he found himself questioning long-held beliefs. Could it be that his perspective had been too narrow all these years? Was it possible that Aisha's vision for a more modernized legal system could be the solution to the problems he had long witnessed, but never truly understood? It was a difficult pill to swallow, but the seeds of doubt had been planted. And with every new piece of information, Collins' certainty began to waver. He was no longer sure that the old ways were enough. Maybe it was time to listen to what Aisha had been saying all along. The tension between Aisha Davis and Judge Thomas Collins had been building for weeks. What had started as a simple fine had morphed into a complex battle over the future of the judicial system. The public was watching, divided over the debate between tradition and reform. The media's portrayal of Aisha as a fierce advocate for change had only intensified the pressure on Collins, who had spent his career upholding a strict, rule-bound interpretation of the law. But as the days went by, he found himself increasingly unable to ignore the sense that something wasn't right. It was a quiet afternoon when Judge Collins made the decision to reach out to Aisha. He had been grappling with his growing doubts for some time now, but he knew that avoiding the issue would only make it worse. He picked up the phone and dialed her office, a mix of reluctance and curiosity in his chest. When Aisha answered, her voice was calm but sharp, a reflection of the resolve that had earned her respect across the country. "Ms. Davis," Collins began, "I've been thinking a lot about the points you've raised over the past few weeks, and I'd like to discuss them with you, privately, if possible." Aisha was quiet for a moment, and Collins could practically hear the wheels turning in her mind. She had always been direct, not one to shy away from confrontation. But this felt different. Perhaps it was his willingness to engage, or perhaps it was the sincerity in his voice, but Aisha agreed to meet him the following day. They met at a quiet cafe, far from the prying eyes of the press. Collins arrived first, a man who had spent decades in the courtroom, but now felt out of place in a casual setting. Aisha arrived soon after, her confident stride and composed demeanor as evident in person as it was in the media. The tension was palpable, but there was also an undercurrent of curiosity between them, two people from opposite ends of a spectrum, about to exchange ideas that could alter the course of their lives. "I'm glad you agreed to meet," Collins began. "I've been reflecting on everything. The fine, your arguments. I'll admit, I've never really considered the changes you're proposing." Aisha took a seat across from him, her eyes steady. "I'm not here to make you feel guilty, Judge. I'm here because I believe the system can be better. I believe it can be more than just a set of rules that keeps people like Malik locked in a cycle of injustice. We have to ask ourselves if those rules still serve their intended purpose. The law needs to evolve, not just in theory, but in practice." Collins nodded slowly, his fingers tapping on his coffee cup. "I've always believed that the law was about consistency, about following the procedures that have been set in place for generations. But I'm starting to see what you mean. Perhaps the way we've been doing things isn't as perfect as I once thought." Aisha leaned forward, sensing the opening. It's not about dismantling the law. It's about making it work for everyone, not just the people who have the resources or privilege to navigate it. We can use technology to help us do that. AI to manage cases more efficiently, data to ensure fairer sentencing. And we can't ignore the fact that so many people still don't trust the system. That needs to change. The conversation continued, both of them speaking candidly, each realizing that they had more in common than they'd initially thought. Collins, who had once viewed Aisha's ideas as radical, was beginning to understand the logic behind them. And Aisha, for the first time, saw a glimmer of someone who was willing to listen, someone who could help bring her vision to life from within the system. The meeting ended with a handshake, a silent acknowledgement of the new road they might be able to walk together. The divide that had seemed so vast only a few weeks ago now felt like something that could be bridged, if only they were willing to keep talking. In the weeks following their meeting, the tension in the air between Aisha Davis and Judge Thomas Collins began to shift. Collins had spent countless hours reflecting on their conversation, grappling with the weight of Aisha's words and the realization that he had perhaps been too rigid in his beliefs. It wasn't just her arguments about the need for reform. It was her unwavering conviction that the system could be made better, more just, and more accessible for everyone. Collins knew that the fine he had imposed on Aisha had become a symbol of everything wrong with the system. It wasn't merely a procedural error. It had become emblematic of the very issues that Aisha had dedicated her career to solving. The more he thought about it, the more he understood that he had allowed his commitment to the status quo to cloud his judgment. Aisha's challenge to the fine was not just a personal matter. It was a reminder of the broader failings of the judicial system he had sworn to uphold. One evening, after a particularly long day of deliberation, Collins sat down at his desk. He stared at the letterhead on his stationery, official, stern, and formal. It felt incongruous now. This wasn't just about following procedures anymore. This was about recognizing a fundamental flaw in how the system had been functioning. He began to write. Dear Ms. Davis, I am writing to formally retract the fine that was imposed on you in my courtroom. After careful reflection, I have come to understand that my decision, while grounded in legal procedure, did not account for the greater issues at play, issues you have so passionately and persuasively raised. I have always believed in the sanctity of the law, but your efforts to modernize the federal justice system have shown me that the law must adapt to the changing needs of society. It must evolve. I realize now that my decision to fine you was not just a misstep in procedure. It was a failure to engage with the deeper questions of equity, accessibility, and efficiency that you have championed. For that, I apologize. I regret that my actions may have caused you additional hardship, and I respect the work you are doing to ensure that the legal system serves all people fairly. Sincerely, Judge Thomas Collins. When Collins sealed the envelope and sent the letter, he wasn't sure what to expect. It felt like the right thing to do, but he also knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to undo the damage his ruling had caused. He hoped, however, that this gesture would signify the beginning of a new chapter, not just for him, but for the system he had served for so long. Aisha received the letter a few days later. At first, she read it with a mixture of skepticism and surprise. The last thing she had expected was an apology from the very man who had imposed the fine. But as she reread his words, something shifted in her. This was more than just a formal retraction. It was an acknowledgement of the validity of her cause, a recognition that the system was not perfect, and that it needed to change. She took a deep breath, then picked up her phone. She dialed Collins' number, and when he answered, she spoke simply but sincerely. Thank you, Judge Collins. I appreciate the apology. Now, let's work together to make the system better. For the first time, both of them understood that their differences weren't insurmountable. In fact, they could be the foundation of something far greater. The months that followed the apology marked a turning point in the relationship between Aisha Davis and Judge Thomas Collins. What had once been a contentious battle over a fine had transformed into a collaborative effort to reform the judicial system from within. Their meetings became more frequent, their conversations more focused, as they explored how to integrate the reforms Aisha had long advocated for, efficiency, equity, and accessibility, into the very fabric of the legal system. Aisha and Collins began to work together on a new initiative aimed at modernizing the federal court system. They started by proposing a pilot program in their own district that would use AI to assist in case management, helping to reduce backlog and ensure that cases were processed in a timely manner. It was a step toward the kind of efficiency that Aisha had envisioned, and Collins, now fully on board, was eager to see it implemented. But it wasn't just about technology. They also began pushing for reforms in sentencing guidelines, advocating for a system that took into account the individual circumstances of each case rather than rigid one-size-fits-all policies. Aisha's efforts to combat racial disparities in the system were given a new, more significant platform with Collins by her side. Together, they pushed for training that would address implicit bias among judges and attorneys, ensuring that the legal process was fair for all people, regardless of their race, socioeconomic status, or background. The journey wasn't without its challenges. Resistance from some of Collins' peers, who still believed in the traditional way of doing things, was expected. But both Aisha and Collins were steadfast. The opposition, while vocal, was slowly drowned out by the growing support they garnered from those who had been advocating for reform for years, but lacked the influence to make real change. It wasn't long before their pilot program became a model for other districts. Judges and attorneys across the country began to take notice of the success they were seeing. AI tools that helped manage caseloads and analyze potential biases were being adopted, and Aisha's vision of a more equitable justice system started to materialize. Slowly but surely, the reforms they had pushed for began to gain traction on a larger scale, making their way into discussions at the highest levels of government. As their work continued, Aisha found herself in the public spotlight more than ever. But now she wasn't just fighting for change. She was seeing it happen. And at every turn, Judge Collins stood beside her, not as an adversary, but as a partner in the pursuit of justice. Their collaboration became a symbol of what was possible when people with differing perspectives put aside their egos and focused on what truly mattered: a justice system that worked for everyone. Aisha and Collins had come to realize that true justice wasn't about maintaining the status quo. It was about understanding, evolving, and most importantly, listening. The fine that had once separated them had become a distant memory, replaced by a shared commitment to a future where the law could be both fair and flexible. Together, they had turned an unexpected conflict into an opportunity for transformative change, proving that even the most entrenched systems could evolve, if only they were willing to listen and grow.